Montana Territory, 1883. The wind howled like a banshee across the Bitterroot Valley, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of a killing frost. Hayden Holloway stood at the edge of the ranch house porch, squinting at the dark clouds rolling in from the north. At 26, he'd seen enough Montana winters to know when death was riding the wind. This storm would be merciless. 3 days, he muttered to himself, calculating the hours until the full fury would descend. Maybe less. Hayden pulled his worn leather gloves tighter and adjusted his hat against the biting wind. The son of a failed prospector and a schoolteacher who died of consumption, he learned young that the frontier gave nothing freely. His father's broken dreams and early grave had taught him the harshest lesson of all. Attachment was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. The only reliable companions were his horse, his gun, and his own 2 hands. The rocking H wasn't much, a modest spread with decent grazing land and a small herd. But it was his, built from nothing after years of backbreaking work for other men. He'd made his peace with solitude. A man who depended on no one couldn't be disappointed, couldn't be abandoned. The frontier was no place for tender feelings. It demanded all your strength just to survive. His gaze drifted to the mountains where the wild mustang herds roamed. Those horses had chosen freedom over comfort, much as he had chosen independence over connection. Perhaps that's why he felt such kinship with them, why he'd never joined the other ranchers who viewed the mustangs as pests or profit. Mr. Holloway. The voice broke through his thoughts. Young Billy Jenkins, his only hired hand, came running from the barn. Rider coming. Hayden's hand instinctively moved to his holster. Unexpected visitors rarely brought good news, especially with winter approaching. The rider came into view. A woman, to Hayden's surprise, her blue dress whipping in the wind as she urged her horse forward at a pace that spoke of urgency. As she drew closer, he saw she was young, perhaps 21 or 22, with golden blonde hair partially escaped from beneath a practical hat. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold and exertion, but there was determination in her posture that suggested this was no casual social call. She reined her horse to a stop. "Mr. Holloway? I'm Josephine Porter. My father sent me. We need your help." Hayden helped her dismount, noticing how gracefully she moved despite her obvious haste. "Miss Porter, what brings you out in this weather?" "Storm's coming fast. That's precisely why I'm here." Her blue eyes met his directly, with none of the coy deference he'd come to expect from the few women he encountered. "The Mustang herds are trapped in the high meadow beyond Blackwater Canyon. If they don't move to lower ground before this storm hits, they'll die. All of them." Something in Hayden's chest tightened. "How many?" "Near 100. Maybe more. My father's been tracking them." She brushed a strand of blonde hair from her face. "He says you're the best horseman in the valley. Says you know those Mustangs better than anyone." "Your father?" "Thomas Porter." Hayden frowned. "The government land agent?" She nodded. "He may work for the government, Mr. Holloway, but he cares about this land and everything on it. He's gathering men now, but we need someone who knows the high country trails. Someone the horses might trust." Hayden looked back at the darkening sky. "Miss Porter, no one can make wild Mustangs do what they don't want to do. And moving 100 panicked horses through mountain passes with a blizzard coming, that's asking for casualties, human and horse alike. So you'll let them die?" Her voice was quiet but cutting. "I thought you were different. The way my father speaks of you, I didn't say that." Hayden felt an unfamiliar defensiveness rise in him. "I'm saying it's a fool's errand that could get people killed." "Then I suppose we'll have to be careful fools." A small, sad smile curved her lips. "I'll be riding with the men at first light tomorrow." "You?" Hayden couldn't hide his surprise. Her chin lifted slightly. "I've been riding these mountains since I was 12, Mr. Holloway. I know every trail between here and the high meadow." Looking at her, this slip of a woman with her steady gaze and straight spine, Hayden felt something shift inside him. Here was someone willing to risk everything for creatures that offered nothing in return but their wild beauty. It contradicted everything he believed about survival on the frontier. "Dawn's in 5 hours, he said finally. "You'll stay here tonight. We'll need supplies and proper gear if we're to have any chance at all." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you." That night, as Josephine slept in his own bed, he'd taken the bunk in the spare room. Hayden sat by the fire and considered the folly of what they were about to attempt. The practical part of him, the part that had kept him alive and independent, argued that risking human lives for wild horses made no sense. But another part, long dormant, recognized something in Josephine Porter that resonated with his own buried nature. Perhaps there was more to survival than merely staying alive. Dawn broke with biting cold and the distant rumble of the approaching storm. Josephine emerged from the bedroom, dressed in practical riding clothes. Clearly her father's influence had extended to sensible frontier attire for his daughter. Her golden hair was neatly braided, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her own capabilities. "We should reach the rendezvous point by mid-morning," she said, accepting the coffee Hayden offered. "My father's gathered about 8 men. With you, that makes 9. 9 men to move 100 panicking horses." Hayden shook his head. "We'll need a miracle. Or someone who understands wild things," she replied, her blue eyes meeting his. "Someone who knows that sometimes freedom needs guidance to survive." The ride to the meeting place was silent, each lost in their own thoughts as they pushed their horses as fast as was safe in the pre-storm conditions. Thomas Porter and his assembled men were already waiting, a mixture of ranch hands, a few miners from the foothills, and Porter himself, a dignified man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. "Holloway." Porter nodded in greeting. "Glad you came. Josephine convinced you, I take it." "She made a compelling case," Hayden replied, not entirely sure what had truly persuaded him. The plight of the horses or the unexpected spark of connection he'd felt with this unusual woman. Porter quickly outlined what they knew. The Mustang herd, normally wise enough to move to lower elevations before winter storms, had been pushed into the high meadow by wolves and remained there, hemmed in by terrain they were reluctant to cross. "There's a pass here." Porter pointed to a crude map. "Steep but passable. If we can get them moving through it, they'll reach safe grazing land before the worst of the storm hits." "And if they panic?" one of the ranch hands asked. "Then we'll have a stampede in dangerous territory," Hayden said bluntly. "These aren't trained horses. They're wild. They'll run where instinct tells them, not where we want." "Unless someone leads them who they trust," Josephine said quietly. All eyes turned to Hayden. He shifted uncomfortably. "I've never worked with this herd specifically. They know me only as someone who occasionally watches from a distance." "But you've never hunted them, never tried to capture them," Porter said. "That puts you ahead of most men they've encountered." The discussion continued as they rode toward the high meadow, the storm clouds growing darker and more threatening with each mile. Hayden found himself repeatedly glancing at Josephine, admiring the easy way she handled her horse on the difficult terrain and the practical intelligence she showed in the ongoing strategy discussion. By early afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking the high meadow. Below them, the Mustang herd grazed nervously, clearly sensing the coming storm but unwilling to venture toward the pass that would lead them to safety. The stallion, a magnificent black with a white blaze, paced at the edge of the herd, occasionally tossing his head toward the sky. "He knows," Josephine murmured. "He knows they need to move, but something's stopping him." Hayden studied the terrain, then pointed. "There. Looks like a rockslide partially blocked the pass they'd normally use. They don't trust it." Porter nodded grimly. "We need to clear enough of it for them to feel safe, then guide them through." "In the 3 hours we have before that storm hits?" one of the miners asked skeptically. "We work with what we have," Hayden said, surprised by his own determination. "4 men to clear what rocks we can. The rest of us will position ourselves to guide the herd once the way is clearer." "I'll help with the rocks," Josephine volunteered. Her father started to protest, but she cut him off. "I'm smaller and quicker than most of you. I can get into tight spaces." Hayden found himself smiling despite the gravity of the situation. "Your daughter doesn't take no for an answer, does she, Porter?" "Never has," Porter replied with a mixture of exasperation and pride. "Gets that from her mother, God rest her soul." As they made their way down to the pass, Hayden and Josephine fell slightly behind the others. "Your mother," Hayden began awkwardly. "Died 5 years ago. Fever." Josephine's voice was matter-of-fact, but Hayden caught the flicker of old pain in her eyes. "She taught me that loving something means fighting for it, even when it seems hopeless." "Is that why you're risking your life for wild horses?" She considered this. "Partly, but also because they belong here. They're part of what makes this land what it is. Losing them would make the territory poorer in ways that can't be measured in dollars." Her words stirred something in Hayden, an echo of feelings he'd suppressed since his father's death, a reminder that there were values beyond mere survival. The work at the rock slide was grueling. The men leveraged boulders aside while Josephine darted between them, clearing smaller rocks and testing the footing. The wind grew stronger, carrying the first icy flakes of snow. Above them, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. "We're running out of time," Porter called over the rising wind. Hayden surveyed their work. They'd cleared enough for horses to pass single file, but it would be slow going for a large herd, especially if they panicked. "I need to go to them," he said suddenly, the plan forming as he spoke. "The stallion, he's the key. If I can get him to trust me enough to lead him through, the others will follow." "That's suicide," one of the ranch hands protested. "You can't just walk up to a wild stallion." "I'm not planning to walk," Hayden replied, already mounting his horse. "I'll ride in slowly. Let him see me as another horse rather than a man." Josephine stepped forward. "I'm coming with you." "No." Both Hayden and Porter spoke simultaneously. "Two riders will seem less threatening than one alone," she argued. "And I've worked with nervous horses all my life." "These aren't just nervous horses, Miss Porter," Hayden said. "These are wild animals that consider humans predators." Her blue eyes flashed. "Which is why they need to see that not all humans mean harm." "I'm coming, Mr. Holloway. Either alongside you or following behind." In that moment, looking at her determined face, Hayden recognized a spirit as independent and resolute as his own. And strangely, instead of frustration, he felt a spark of admiration. "Stay behind me. If I signal you to retreat, you do it immediately. No questions." She nodded, already mounting her horse. They approached the herd slowly, keeping their movements calm and deliberate despite the urgency drumming in their veins. The mustangs grew alert, several raising their heads to watch the interlopers. The stallion moved to position himself between the strangers and his herd, his posture a clear warning. "Easy," Hayden murmured, though he knew the horse couldn't understand his words. "We're here to help you, though you don't know it." For nearly 20 minutes, they simply sat their horses at a respectful distance, allowing the wild herd to grow accustomed to their presence. The snow began falling more heavily, and the wind cut through their clothing with icy precision. "We're running out of time," Josephine said quietly. Hayden nodded. With careful movements, he guided his horse in a wide arc, aiming to position himself where he could begin moving the herd toward the pass. The stallion watched, nostrils flaring, but didn't charge. "He's curious," Josephine observed. "Not just defensive. Curious can turn to fear quick enough," Hayden warned. "Especially with a storm coming." As if to punctuate his words, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. Several of the mustangs tossed their heads nervously. "We need to move them now," Hayden said. "Follow my lead." What followed was a delicate dance of pressure and release. Hayden and Josephine moved in careful coordination, applying just enough presence to urge the herd in the right direction without triggering panic. The stallion resisted initially, charging at them several times, forcing them to retreat temporarily before trying again. "He's testing us," Josephine called over the wind. "Testing our intentions," Hayden agreed. "He needs to decide we're less dangerous than the storm." After what seemed an eternity, but was perhaps only 40 minutes, the lead Mares began moving in the direction of the pass. The stallion, seeing this, circled once more before reluctantly following, keeping himself between the human riders and his herd. "It's working." Josephine's voice carried an undercurrent of excitement despite her obvious exhaustion. The other men had positioned themselves strategically along the route, staying far enough back not to spook the horses, but close enough to help guide stragglers. As the first horses reached the partially cleared rock slide, they hesitated, snorting and pawing at the ground. "This is the moment," Hayden murmured. "If they turn back now." To his amazement, Josephine began to sing. It wasn't loud, just a soft, melodic humming that somehow carried over the wind. The horses' ears pricked forward, their attention diverted momentarily from the obstacle before them. In that moment of distraction, the lead mare picked her way carefully through the pass. Others followed, gaining confidence with each successful crossing. The stallion remained vigilant, occasionally looking back at the human riders with wary intelligence. The snow was falling in earnest now, reducing visibility and making the footing treacherous. Hayden and Josephine stayed with the rear of the herd, ensuring no stragglers were left behind. The other men moved ahead, guiding the front of the herd down towards safer ground. "We're going to make it," Josephine said, her face alight with the particular joy that comes from witnessing something extraordinary. It happened in an instant. A young colt, perhaps 4 months old, slipped on the increasingly icy ground and fell, letting out a frightened whinny. Its mother circled back, but in her anxiety, she blocked the path for those behind her. Horses began to mill in confusion, threatening to turn the orderly evacuation into chaos. Without hesitation, Josephine urged her horse forward, slipping between the mustangs with remarkable agility. Hayden called out a warning, but she was already dismounting, approaching the fallen colt with slow, deliberate movements. The mare snorted and pawed the ground, torn between protecting her foal and fleeing from the human. The stallion wheeled around, sensing the disruption. "Hold him back," Josephine called to Hayden, her voice somehow both urgent and calm. "Just for a minute." Hayden positioned himself between the stallion and Josephine, knowing he had little actual control over the powerful animal, but hoping his presence would create enough hesitation. His heart pounded as he watched Josephine crouch beside the struggling colt, her movements gentle but efficient as she examined its leg. "It's not broken," she called over her shoulder. "Just scared." With careful hands, she helped the colt regain its footing. The moment it was stable, she backed away, allowing the mare to reclaim her offspring. The colt wobbled, then found its strength, pressing against its mother's side. The disruption had lasted less than 3 minutes, but in that time, the storm had intensified dramatically. Visibility had dropped to mere yards, and the temperature plummeted with the darkening sky. "We need to move," Hayden called, relief at Josephine's safety mixing with new urgency. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen." "Sometimes they're the same thing," she replied, remounting with snow-numbed fingers. They continued the delicate herding operation as the storm worsened around them. By the time the last of the mustangs cleared the dangerous high ground, the blizzard was upon them in full force. Hayden and Josephine found themselves separated from the others, having stayed behind to ensure no horses remained. "We can't make it back to the ranch in this," Hayden shouted over the howling wind. "There's a line shack about 2 miles from here. We need to hole up until it passes." Josephine nodded, too cold for further conversation. They rode close together, their horses leaning into the wind as they made their slow, treacherous way toward shelter. Hayden found himself watching her with growing concern. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and despite her determination, her shoulders had begun to slump with cold and fatigue. The line shack, when they finally reached it, was little more than 4 walls and a roof, with a small iron stove and a single cot. But after the howling wilderness outside, it felt like a palace. "Get inside," Hayden urged, taking the reins of her horse. "I'll see to the animals." "I can help," she began, but he cut her off. "You've done enough helping for one day. Get warm." "That's an order." To his surprise, she didn't argue further, a testament to how truly exhausted she must have been. He worked quickly to shelter the horses in the lean-to at the back of the cabin, covering them with the emergency blankets he carried in his saddlebags. When he finally stumbled inside, snow crusting his hat and coat, he found Josephine had managed to start a small fire in the stove using the meager supply of wood stacked beside it. "It's not much," she said, her teeth still chattering, "but it's something." "You're something," he replied without thinking, then felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "I mean, what you did out there today was necessary," she finished simply. "As was what you did. We saved them, Mr. Holloway." "Hayden," he corrected, shrugging out of his snow-caked coat. "After today, I think we've earned first-name terms." Her smile, though tinged with exhaustion, warmed something in him that had been cold for years. "Hayden, then. And I'm Josephine. Or Josie, to friends." "Are we friends?" he asked, genuinely curious. She considered this as he moved around the small space, finding a few more pieces of wood and adding them carefully to their precious fire. "I think," she said finally, "that when 2 people face death together and choose to fight instead of surrender, they become something that doesn't have an adequate name. Friend seems insufficient." The simplicity and truth of her statement struck him deeply. Here was a woman who understood the frontier not as something to be feared or conquered, but as something to be engaged with integrity and courage. You could have been killed today, he said, the realization hitting him anew. That stallion could have trampled you when you went for the colt. Yes. She didn't deny it or minimize the danger. But I wasn't. Why take the risk? They're just wild horses. Her eyes met his, steady and clear despite her exhaustion. Nothing that fights so hard to live and be free is just anything. Those horses have as much right to survive this winter as we do. In that moment, something crystallized in Hayden's understanding. His philosophy of isolated self-reliance suddenly seemed hollow compared to Josephine's willingness to risk herself for creatures that would never thank her, never even understand what she'd done for them. The blizzard raged through the night, confining them to the tiny shack with its dwindling firewood and growing cold. They huddled together for warmth, propriety forgotten in the face of survival. Hayden found himself acutely aware of her presence, the light scent of her hair, the steady rhythm of her breathing as she finally slept against his shoulder. He had spent years believing that attachment was weakness, that caring for others was a liability on the frontier. Yet this woman, with her fierce compassion and practical courage, had accomplished more in one day than he had in years of careful self-preservation. Morning broke with eerie silence, the storm having blown itself out during the night. When they emerged from the shack, they found a transformed world, everything smoothed and whitened by several feet of snow. But the air was clear, and in the distance, they could see the Mustang herd, safe on the lower grazing grounds. They made it. Josephine's voice was soft with wonder. We made it, Hayden corrected, finding his gaze drawn not to the horses but to her face, alight with the particular beauty that comes from witnessing the triumph of life over adversity. The ride back to civilization was arduous but peaceful. They found the other men had made it safely to Porter's homestead, and the reunion was joyful, if subdued by exhaustion. You took a hell of a risk, Porter told his daughter privately, though Hayden overheard. But you saved those horses. Your mother would have been proud. That evening, as Hayden prepared to return to his own ranch, Josephine walked with him to the stable. Will you come back? She asked directly. Or will you return to your solitude now that the crisis is past? Her question caught him off guard with its perception. I've always believed that depending on others was a weakness out here, he admitted. That attachment only led to loss. And now, he looked at her, really looked, and saw not just beauty, but the rare combination of strength and tenderness that made her who she was. Now I'm considering the possibility that I've been wrong all these years. That perhaps real strength lies in what we're willing to risk, not what we're determined to protect. Her smile then was like sunrise after the longest night. That sounds like a beginning, Mr. Holloway. Hayden, he reminded her. Hayden, she agreed. A good name for a man who helped save wild things. He returned the next day, and the day after. Through the winter, he found reasons to ride to the Porter homestead, bringing supplies, helping with repairs, checking on the Mustang herd that now grazed in the protected valley below the house. With each visit, the walls he'd built around himself weakened. He found himself sharing stories of his childhood, of his father's failed dreams, and his mother's quiet courage. Josephine, in turn, told him of her life with her widowed father, of her mother's teachings about respecting the land and all its creatures. She believed we weren't meant to conquer the frontier, Josephine explained one evening as they sat by the fire, but to find our place within it, to become part of its story rather than trying to ride over it. By spring, when the snow melted and the first wildflowers appeared in the meadows, Hayden had come to a realization that both terrified and exhilarated him. He had fallen in love with Josephine Porter. Not just her beauty or her courage, but her whole being, her philosophy of life that was so different from his own, yet somehow completed what was missing in him. But old fears die hard. The night he finally gathered his courage to speak, disaster struck. A telegram arrived for Thomas Porter. The government land office was reassigning him to Wyoming territory. They would be leaving within the month. You could come with us, Thomas suggested to Hayden after sharing the news. Wyoming's got good ranching land. You could start fresh. My ranch is here, Hayden said automatically, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Later, walking with Josephine under a sky brilliant with stars, he tried to find words for the turmoil inside him. Wyoming isn't so far, she said, her voice carefully neutral. People visit back and forth all the time. Is that what you want? Occasional visits? She stopped walking and turned to face him directly. What I want, she said with characteristic honesty, is to build a life with someone who understands that loving freely doesn't make you weak. It makes you infinitely stronger. Someone who sees value in all living things, not just those that serve a practical purpose. Someone who, her voice faltered slightly, someone who looks at me the way you sometimes do when you think I'm not noticing. The directness of her declaration left him momentarily speechless. In that silence, doubt crept into her expression. Unless I've misread, no, he interrupted, finding his voice at last. You haven't misread anything. I just never expected. I've spent so many years convinced that caring too much was dangerous out here. It is dangerous, she agreed. Love is always a risk. But a life without it is no life at all, just survival. The simplicity and truth of her words struck him to the core. Standing there under the vast Montana sky, Hayden finally understood what he had been missing in his pursuit of independence. Not weakness or vulnerability, but the particular strength that comes from having something, someone, worth fighting for. I love you, he said, the words feeling both foreign and absolutely right. I think I have since that day in the blizzard when you risked everything for creatures that could never thank you. Her smile then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. And I've loved you since I saw you choose compassion over caution, even when every instinct told you otherwise. But still, the practical realities remained. Your father's position, Wyoming. Father received another telegram this afternoon, she said, a hint of mischief in her eyes. It seems someone with influence requested that the government's land agent remain in Montana territory, citing his invaluable knowledge of local conditions and relationships with the settlers. Hayden's brow furrowed. Someone with influence? Who? The same someone who apparently wrote a detailed report about how the wild horse herds are an essential part of the territory's natural balance and should be protected from overhunting. Her eyes sparkled. A certain rancher whose reputation for understanding both the land and its creatures has apparently reached as far as the governor's office. Realization dawned slowly. My letter. I never expected anyone to actually read it, let alone act on it. Well, they did. Father stays, the horses are protected, and I. She hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. I await an answer to a question you haven't asked yet. Heart pounding, Hayden took her hands in his. The words came easier than he'd expected, as if they'd been waiting years to be spoken. Josephine Porter, will you marry me? Not because we need each other to survive out here, but because together, we can do more than merely survive. We can truly live. Yes, she said simply. I will. They were married that June, when the wildflowers carpeted the valley and the Mustang foals were taking their first wobbly steps. Thomas Porter gave his daughter away with proud tears in his eyes, and half the territory attended the celebration that followed. Their wedding gift to each other was a pledge. Part of their ranch would always remain open range where the wild horses could roam freely. In return, the Mustangs seemed to adopt the rocking H as part of their territory, sometimes grazing within sight of the ranch house. The stallion watching over his growing herd with the same protective vigilance Hayden now felt toward his own expanding family. Over the years, as children came and the ranch prospered, Hayden often thought back to that desperate race against the winter storm. How something that had begun as an attempt to save wild creatures had ended up saving him from the prison of his own making. The belief that strength meant standing alone. On their 10th anniversary, he took Josephine to the ridge overlooking the valley where the Mustang herd still thrived. The stallion, now showing signs of age but still magnificent, acknowledged their presence with a toss of his proud head before returning to his family. Do you ever regret it? Hayden asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. Staying here instead of seeking adventure elsewhere? Josephine leaned into him, watching their 2 children running ahead on the trail, as wild and free as the horses they had helped save. Never, she said with the certainty that was so essentially her. Adventure isn't about the ground you cover, but the life you build on the ground where you stand. Looking out over the land they had protected together, at the horses running free, at their children growing strong and compassionate, at the community they had helped to build, Hayden felt the truth of her words in his very bones. The frontier wasn't something to be conquered or survived. It was something to be loved, respected, and shared. just like the heart he had once guarded so carefully, only to discover its true strength when finally opened wide.